January 17, 1945. Somewhere in the frozen hills west of the Our River, Belgium, the wind cut through the pines like a blade. A column of M4 Shermans sat idling in a shallow draw, their engines coughing diesel smoke into the gray morning air. Snow clung to their sloped hulls. The crews were silent, breath fogging in the cold, hands wrapped around thermoses of bitter coffee. From a ridge 300 meters east, a German Tiger commander lowered his binoculars and smiled. He turned to his gunner and said something in clipped Prussian German. The gunner laughed. The loader nodded. The words didn't need translation. Blechbuchsen, tin cans. The Tigers had been hunting since dawn. 8 of them, spread across the ridge in a textbook defensive arc. Their 88mm guns could punch through a Sherman's front plate at 1,000 meters. The Americans didn't stand a chance, but the American crew in the lead Sherman, callsign Cobra, had already seen them, and they weren't retreating. The tank commander, a staff sergeant from Pennsylvania, reached down and touched a coil of salvaged cargo rope lashed to the turret bustle. His gunner glanced back at him. Waiting, the sergeant keyed his radio. All units, hold position. Wait for my mark. What happened in the next 11 minutes would rewrite the rules of armored combat. The M4 Sherman was never supposed to be a legend. It was supposed to be enough. When American engineers began designing the tank in 1940, they weren't chasing technological supremacy. They were chasing production. The war in Europe was already raging. France had fallen. Britain was bleeding. The United States Army needed a medium tank that could be built in massive numbers, shipped across oceans, and maintained by crews with minimal training. The Sherman was the answer to that equation. It weighed 30 tons. It mounted a 75mm gun, decent, but not exceptional. Its armor was sloped at the front, but only 51mm thick at its strongest point. It could move at 25 miles per hour on roads, but crawled through mud. It ran on a gasoline engine, which meant it caught fire easier than diesel-powered designs. It was cramped inside. The crew of 5 sat shoulder to shoulder, breathing recycled air that reeked of oil and cordite. But it worked. By 1942, American factories were churning out Shermans at a rate Nazi Germany couldn't match with all its vaunted engineering. Ford, Chrysler, and Fisher Body converted their assembly lines. Press Steel Car Company built hulls. The tanks rolled off the line at a pace of over 2,000 per month at peak production. They were shipped to North Africa, to Britain, to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. The Sherman became the backbone of Allied armored power not because it was the best tank in the world, but because there were so many of them. And in North Africa, that was enough. When American crews first met Rommel's Afrika Korps in the deserts of Tunisia in late 1942, the Sherman performed well. German Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs were comparable opponents. The 75mm gun could penetrate their armor at combat ranges. American crews learned quickly. They used superior numbers, coordinated infantry support, and overwhelming air power to grind down the German defenses. By May 1943, North Africa was lost to the Axis. The Sherman had proven itself, but the war was about to change. In the summer of 1943, Germany introduced a new generation of heavy tanks. The Panzer V Panther and the Panzer VI Tiger weren't incremental improvements. They were paradigm shifts. The Panther mounted a long-barreled 75mm gun that could kill a Sherman at ranges the American tank couldn't even return fire. The Tiger was worse. It weighed 54 tons. Its frontal armor was 100mm thick, nearly double the Sherman's. Its 88mm gun, derived from the legendary Flak 36 anti-aircraft cannon, could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. When the first Tigers appeared in Tunisia in late 1942, they were rare. Exotic. By 1944, they were doctrine. German tankers began to speak of the Sherman with contempt. They called it Tommy Coker, the Tommy Cooker, because of how easily it caught fire when penetrated. They called it cardboard. They joked that 5 Shermans were needed to kill 1 Tiger, 4 to die drawing fire, and 1 to flank and finish the job. The math was brutal, and it wasn't entirely wrong. In Normandy, after D-Day in June 1944, American tank crews encountered the bocage, narrow lanes hemmed in by thick hedgerows and stone walls. It was ambush country. German panthers and tigers hid in tree lanes, waited for Sherman columns to advance, and opened fire at point-blank range. The first shot usually killed. A Sherman hit in the front glacis by an 88mm round didn't just stop, it exploded. The armor plug blown inward became shrapnel. Ammunition ignited. Fuel burned. Crews had seconds to bail out, and many didn't make it. The nickname Ronsons spread among the ranks, after the cigarette lighter company whose slogan was "Lights first time, every time." Morale suffered. Crews requested better tanks. The Army had them. The M26 Pershing, with a 90mm gun and thicker armor, but it was still in development. Logistics chains were stretched thin. Shermans were what they had, and Shermans were what they would fight. So American tank crews adapted. They learned not to fight fair. The Tiger I was Germany's answer to a problem they didn't yet have in 1941 when Operation Barbarossa launched in June of that year. German Panzer IIIs and IVs swept across Soviet territory with devastating efficiency. But then they encountered the T-34 and the KV-1, Soviet tanks with sloped armor and powerful guns that could shrug off German fire. The Wehrmacht was stunned. For the first time in the war, German tankers found themselves outmatched. Hitler demanded a response. The result was the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Ausf. The Tiger I.It entered service in August 1942, and it was a monster. The Tiger weighed 54 tons, nearly twice that of a Sherman. Its frontal armor was 100mm thick, vertical but massive. Its sides were 80mm. The 88mm KWK-36L/56 gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges where return fire was impossible. Its optics were superb. Its crew of 5 operated in relative comfort compared to cramped Soviet or American designs. But the Tiger was expensive, complex, difficult to produce. Germany would build only 1,347 Tigers during the entire war, a fraction of the 50,000 Shermans that rolled off American assembly lines. Still, the psychological impact was immense. Tiger battalions, Schwer Panzerabteilungen, were deployed as elite breakthrough units. They didn't fight in mass formations. They were scalpels, not hammers. A single Tiger platoon could anchor a defensive line or spearhead an assault, and Allied crews learned to fear the sound of their engines. To be why the winter of 1944, the Western Front, had become a grinding war of attrition. The Allied advance from Normandy had stalled in the Hürtgen forest and along the German border. Supply lines stretched thin. The weather turned brutal. Snow blanketed the Ardennes, the densely forested plateau region straddling Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. Hitler saw an opportunity that on December 16, 1944, Germany launched Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, better known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, smashed into the thinly defended American lines in the Ardennes. The goal was audacious: split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. The offensive achieved total surprise. American units were overrun. Entire regiments were encircled. The front line buckled inward, forming the bulge that gave the battle its name. Among the German spearheads were elite SS Panzer divisions equipped with Tigers and the even heavier King Tigers. For the first 2 weeks, the Germans advanced with shocking speed, but the weather began to clear in late December. Allied air power returned. American reinforcements poured into the salient. And the tank crews, those who had survived the initial onslaught, began to fight back with a ferocity born of desperation. The Sherman, by this point in the war, was a different machine than the one that had landed in North Africa. Field modifications had become standard. Crews welded spare track links to the glacis for extra armor. They mounted sandbags, logs, concrete, anything to add protection. They learned to angle their hulls, to use terrain, to never fight from a static position. Commanders studied German tactics, learning to predict where Tigers would position themselves and how to exploit their weaknesses. Because the Tiger did have weaknesses. It was slow. Its top speed was 24 miles per hour on roads, but in mud or snow it crawled. Its wide tracks distributed weight well, but its transmission was fragile. It guzzled fuel, 1.3 gallons per mile. Its turret traverse was powered but sluggish compared to the Sherman's hydraulic system. And most critically, its side and rear armor were far thinner than the front. An 88mm round could punch through a Sherman's front plate, but a 75mm Sherman round could penetrate a Tiger's side at close range. The key was getting close, and that required more than courage. It required creativity. American crews began using what they called crew tricks, improvised tactics born from months of hard fighting. They rigged camouflage nets with local foliage to break up their silhouettes. They used smoke grenades to obscure movement. Some crews tied ropes and cables to trees or wrecked vehicles, using them as pivot points to swing the tank rapidly in tight spaces, allowing faster repositioning without exposing their vulnerable sides. One crew, in particular, had perfected the technique to be why January 1945, Staff Sergeant Michael Kellerman's crew, callsign Cobra, had been fighting in the Ardennes for 3 weeks. They had survived 2 ambushes, knocked out 4 German tanks, and lost half their original platoon. Kellerman, a 24-year-old machinist from Scranton, Pennsylvania, had learned to trust his instincts and his crew more than doctrine. And when his platoon was ordered to hold a ridge west of the Our River on the morning of January 17th, he knew the Germans would come. What he didn't know was that 8 Tigers were already waiting. Fear is a constant companion in armored warfare. American Sherman crews in early 1945 lived with a calculus of death that was brutally simple. If they saw a Tiger first, they had a chance. If the Tiger saw them first, they were already dead. The sound alone was enough to trigger panic. The deep, guttural rumble of a Maybach HL-230 engine was unmistakable. Veteran crews could distinguish it from the higher-pitched whine of a Panther or the clatter of a Panzer IV. When that sound echoed through a forest or across a frozen field, hearts raced. Hands tightened on controls. Gunners scanned tree lanes with desperate intensity. But fear could be managed. Kellerman's crew had learned to compartmentalize. His driver, Corporal Eddie Rourke from Boston, focused only on terrain, where to position, where to reverse, where to find cover. His gunner, Private First Class James Tackett from Kentucky, lived inside his gun sight, blocking out everything except target acquisition and range estimation. His loader, Private Roy Lindstrom from Minnesota, moved with mechanical precision, slamming 75mm rounds into the breech without thinking. His bow gunner and assistant driver, Private Hank Dombrowski from Detroit, kept his .30 caliber machine gun ready and watched the flanks. They didn't talk about dying. They talked about not dying. And that meant thinking differently than the Germans expected. German tankers operated from a position of technical superiority. Their training emphasized armor doctrine, fire discipline, and the overwhelming advantage of the 88mm gun. They believed in the machine. They trusted the steel. When a Tiger commander saw a Sherman, he didn't see a threat. He saw a target. That arrogance was a weakness Kellerman intended to exploit. The Sherman was outgunned, but it wasn't outclassed. What it lacked in armor and firepower, it made up for in reliability, speed, and adaptability. The tank's vertical volute spring suspension, criticized by some as outdated, actually provided a stable firing platform and excellent mobility across rough terrain. The hydraulic turret traverse allowed the gunner to track moving targets far faster than a Tiger's electric system. The Sherman could reverse at nearly the same speed it advanced, a critical advantage in hit-and-run engagements. And it was fast that a Sherman could accelerate from a stop to full speed in seconds. It could pivot in place by braking one track and accelerating the other. In close terrain, forests, villages, hedgerows, this agility was decisive. A Tiger needed space to operate. A Sherman could fight in a phone booth. The 75mm M3 gun, while inferior to the 88mm in penetration, was no pop gun. At ranges under 500 meters, it could penetrate the side armor of a Tiger Eye. The key was ammunition selection. American crews carried multiple shell types: M72 AP, armor-piercing; M61 APC, armor-piercing capped; and M48 He, high-explosive. Against heavy armor, the M61 round, with its hardened penetrator and ballistic cap, was the weapon of choice. But penetration wasn't everything. A Sherman could fire faster than a Tiger. The loader's position, the ammunition stowage layout, and the crew's training allowed for sustained rates of fire exceeding 6 rounds per minute under combat conditions. A Tiger, with its 2-piece ammunition and heavier shells, averaged 3 to 4 rounds per minute in a prolonged engagement. Volume of fire mattered. Kellerman's crew had drilled endlessly. Tackett could acquire and engage a target in under 4 seconds. Lindstrom could load and ready the gun in under 6. They had fired hundreds of practice rounds, learning to judge distance by eye, to lead moving targets, to compensate for wind and elevation. They knew their machine intimately, and they knew that in the right circumstances, a Sherman could kill a Tiger. Hubris is a silent killer. By January 1945, German panzer crews had been fighting for over 5 years. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front, where they had faced waves of Soviet T-34s and learned to trust their armor and guns absolutely. The Tiger, in particular, had earned a mythical reputation within the Wehrmacht. Crews who commanded them saw themselves as an elite. The Schwarzträger, the sword-bearers of the Reich. This confidence was not entirely misplaced. The Tiger's combat record was formidable. In Normandy, a single Tiger commanded by SS Oberscharführer Michael Wittmann had destroyed over 20 Allied tanks and armored vehicles in a single engagement at Villers-Bocage. Stories like this circulated through the ranks, reinforcing the belief that German engineering and training made them invincible. But the war had changed. By 1945, Germany was bleeding. Fuel shortages limited training for new crews. Experienced commanders were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Maintenance suffered. Spare parts became scarce. Tigers that broke down were abandoned because there was no fuel to recover them. And yet, the psychological advantage remained. When the 8 Tigers positioned themselves on the ridge overlooking the Our River Valley on the morning of January 17th, their commanders felt no urgency. They had identified the American Sherman column in the draw below. They had the high ground, clear fields of fire, and overwhelming firepower. The engagement would be a formality. Engage at range, destroy the lead tanks, watch the survivors retreat. The Tiger commanders didn't call for reconnaissance. They didn't reposition for overlapping fields of fire. They didn't anticipate that the Americans might have a plan. They simply waited. And in that waiting, they gave Kellerman the only advantage he needed: time. War strips away theory and leaves only what works. By the winter of 1945, American tank crews had become masters of improvisation. The Sherman that rolled off the factory floor in Detroit was not the Sherman that fought in the Ardennes. Months of combat had taught crews that survival depended on adaptation, and the tanks reflected that brutal education. Kellerman's Sherman, Cobra, was a patchwork of field modifications. Spare track links were welded across the glacis plate in overlapping layers, adding roughly 30 millimeters of extra steel. Sandbags filled the gaps between the spare tracks and the hull, creating a crude but effective spaced armor that could disrupt shape-charge warheads. A salvaged wooden beam was bolted to the front, originally intended as a hedgerow cutter in Normandy, now serving as a makeshift bumper and battering ram for forcing through debris. The turret carried additional modifications. Extra ammunition boxes were strapped to the bustle, positioned to absorb splinters from near misses. A camouflage net, woven with pine branches and frozen mud, broke up the tank's silhouette. The commander's cupola was reinforced with a ring of salvaged steel plate, offering protection during open-hatch operations. But the most unusual modification was the rope. Kellerman had scavenged nearly 60 feet of heavy cargo rope from an abandoned supply depot 2 weeks earlier. He'd watched combat engineers use similar rigging to winch vehicles out of mud, and an idea had formed. If a rope could move a 5-ton truck, it could move a 30-ton tank, or at least pivot it. The crew had practiced in a clearing behind the lines. They would anchor the rope to a tree or a solid post, loop it around the tank's tow hooks, then reverse hard while keeping one track locked. The physics were crude but effective. The rope acted as a fulcrum, allowing the Sherman to swing its hull at sharp angles without needing space to maneuver. In tight terrain, it was the difference between life and death. Rourke, the driver, had perfected the timing. Tackett, the gunner, learned to anticipate the swing and keep his reticle steady. Lindstrom kept tension on the rope from inside the turret, ready to release if it snagged. It was unorthodox. It wasn't in any manual. But it worked, and Kellerman believed it would work again. Doctrine is written by men who survive. Kellerman intended to be one of them. Standard U.S. Army tank tactics in 1945 emphasized maneuver warfare. Use speed and numbers to flank enemy armor, concentrate fire, and overwhelm through combined arms. But doctrine assumed numerical superiority and air support. On the morning of January 17th, Kellerman had neither. His platoon consisted of 4 Shermans. The other 3 were positioned in defilade behind the ridgeline, engines cold to avoid detection. They were his reserve, his insurance. But Kellerman knew that if the Tigers on the opposite ridge opened fire en masse, all 4 tanks would be destroyed before they could return effective fire. So he chose not to fight the battle the Germans expected. Instead of advancing into the open valley where the Tigers had clear lines of sight, Kellerman planned to draw them forward. He ordered his platoon to remain hidden while Cobra moved into a visible position near the edge of the draw. The other crews protested over the radio. It was suicide. But Kellerman was firm. They won't shoot immediately, he told them. They'll wait to see if there are more of us. That's when we move. The plan hinged on understanding German doctrine. Tiger commanders were trained to engage at maximum range, using their superior optics and gun to destroy targets before they could close. But they were also cautious. Ammunition was precious. Fuel was scarce. A good commander didn't waste shots on isolated targets when there might be an entire column hidden nearby. Kellerman was gambling that the Germans would hesitate, and in that hesitation, he would attack. The maneuver Kellerman planned was simple in concept, brutal in execution. The terrain favored him in one critical way. The draw where his platoon was positioned was lined with thick pines and rocky outcrops. The trees were old growth, their trunks thick enough to anchor a rope under tension. Kellerman had identified 3 anchor points during his reconnaissance the previous evening. Trees positioned at angles that would allow Cobra to pivot rapidly without exposing its thin side armor for more than seconds. Here's how it would work. First, Rourke would drive Cobra to the edge of the draw, visible to the Tigers, but still partially concealed by terrain. The Germans would spot them. They would range the target. But they wouldn't fire immediately. Not if they thought more tanks were coming. Second, once the Tigers committed to engaging, Kellerman would order Rourke to reverse hard while Dombrowski, the assistant driver, threw the rope loop around the nearest anchor tree. The rope would snap taut. The tank would pivot on its axis, swinging the hull nearly 90 degrees in under 3 seconds. Third, during that pivot, Tackett would acquire the nearest Tiger through his gun sight. The moment the hull stabilized, he would fire. At close range, under 400 meters, the 75mm gun could penetrate a Tiger's side armor. One shot, one kill, then repeat. The trick was timing. If the rope snagged, the tank would stall. If Tackett missed, they'd be exposed with no cover. If the Germans realized what was happening and adjusted their aim, Cobra would burn. But Kellerman had drilled his crew relentlessly. They knew their roles. They trusted each other. And trust, in the end, was the only armor that mattered. The morning cold deepened. The wind carried the scent of pine and diesel. Somewhere across the valley, 8 Tigers waited. Kellerman keyed his radio one last time. All units, stand by. This is it. 0847 hours. January 17th, 1945. **** Rourke nudged the throttle forward. The Sherman crept out of the tree-line, tracks crunching through the frozen crust of snow. The engine rumbled low, a steady growl that seemed too loud in the silence of the valley. Kellerman stood in the commander's cupola, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the ridgeline 800 meters to the east. He didn't have to wait long. Through the optics, he saw movement. A Tiger's long barrel shifted slightly, tracking left. Then another. The Germans had seen them. Contact. Ridge, 2 o'clock. Multiple targets, Kellerman said calmly into the intercom. Inside the turret, Tackett swung the gun to the right, peering through his periscope. The distant shapes of the Tigers were unmistakable, massive, angular hulls silhouetted against the gray sky. He counted 4 visible. There would be more. Range. Tackett asked. 800 meters. Too far. Hold fire. Kellerman watched the tigers through his binoculars. They weren't moving. Their guns were trained on Cobra, but no muzzle flashes erupted. The German commanders were doing exactly what he'd predicted, waiting to see if more American tanks would emerge. Driver, advance 50 meters. Slow. Rourke eased the Sherman forward. The tank crawled down the shallow slope, every meter bringing them closer to the killing zone. Kellerman's heart hammered in his chest, but his voice remained steady. Dombrowski, rope ready. Ready, Sarge. The coil of cargo rope sat on the rear deck. One end looped through the tow shackle, the other held loosely in Dombrowski's hands. The bow gunner crouched low, eyes fixed on the tree lean to their left where the first anchor point waited, a thick pine trunk, scarred and ancient. All units, hold position. Kellerman radioed to the other 3 Shermans hidden behind the ridge. Do not move until I give the word. Static crackled. Copy. The seconds stretched. Kellerman could see the tigers more clearly now. 700 meters. Their hulls were massive, even at this distance. The long barrels of the 88mm guns looked like telephone poles. He knew that at any moment, one of those guns would fire. The shell would cross the distance in less than 2 seconds. If it hit, Cobra would disintegrate, but the Germans still waited. Come on, Kellerman whispered. Show me what you've got. Then, movement point one of the tigers lurched forward, its tracks grinding. It rolled 10 meters down the ridge, repositioning for a better angle. The commander's hatch was open. Kellerman could see the silhouette of a man in the cupola, scanning with binoculars. That was the signal. The German commander had committed. He believed Cobra was alone. He was moving to engage. Driver, reverse. Hard right now. Rourke slammed the transmission into reverse and floored the throttle. The Sherman roared backward, tracks churning snow and frozen mud. At the same moment, Dombrowski flung the rope loop toward the anchor tree. It caught on the first try, the heavy rope snapping around the trunk. The rope went taut. The Sherman's rear tow hooks bit into the line, and physics took over. The tank's momentum, combined with the resistance of the anchored rope, swung the 30-ton hull in a violent arc. The track screamed. The turret basket tilted as the tank pivoted nearly 90 degrees in 3 seconds. Kellerman gripped the cupola rim, his body thrown sideways by the G-force. Inside the turret, Tackett fought to keep his eye pressed to the gun sight. The horizon spun. Trees blurred past. Then, suddenly, the world stabilized. And there, framed perfectly in his reticle, was the side profile of the lead Tiger. 600 meters. Target. Tank. Side armor. Lindstrom had already slammed an M61 armor-piercing round into the breech. The gun was loaded. Tackett's hand hovered over the firing lever. He exhaled, squeezed. The 75mm gun erupted. The shell left the barrel at 619 meters per second, a streak of hardened steel and chemical energy. It crossed the distance in just over a second. The Tiger commander, still scanning with his binoculars, never saw it coming. The round struck the Tiger's side armor at a shallow angle, just below the turret ring. The 80mm plate, designed to resist frontal impacts, offered less protection against side shots. The shell punched through, the penetrator core burning white-hot as it tore into the interior. Inside the Tiger, hell erupted. The penetrator struck the ammunition rack. 40 88mm shells, each packed with propellant and high explosive, detonated in a chain reaction. The blast tore the turret clean off the hull. A column of flame and black smoke shot 30 meters into the air. The Tiger's hull split open like a cracked egg, spilling fire and debris onto the snow. The German crew never had a chance to scream. Kellerman saw the explosion through his binoculars. For a split second, he felt nothing. Then, adrenaline surged. Target destroyed. Reload. Next target, left, 500 meters. But the Germans were already reacting. The remaining 7 Tigers opened fire. The valley erupted in sound and fury. The crack of 88mm guns echoed like thunder. Shells screamed through the air, supersonic banshees hunting for American steel. One round slammed into the ground 10 meters to Cobra's right, throwing up a geyser of frozen earth. Another whistled overhead, so close Kellerman felt the pressure wave. Driver, reverse. Second anchor point. Go, go, go. Rourke threw the Sherman into reverse again, racing backward toward the second pine tree. Dombrowski released the first rope, letting it fall slack, then grabbed the second loop. The tank skidded through the snow, tracks fighting for traction. Another 88mm shell impacted where Cobra had been 3 seconds earlier. Rope's good, Dombrowski shouted. The second pivot was even more violent than the first. The Sherman swung in a tight arc, the suspension groaning under the strain. Tackett fought to keep his sight picture, his forehead pressed painfully against the padded rim of the periscope. The world spun and stopped. Another Tiger, closer now. 400 meters. Side profile. The German crew was traversing their turret, trying to track the American tank, but the hydraulic system was too slow. Target. Up. Fire. The second shot was perfect. The 75mm round struck the Tiger's side just behind the drive sprocket. It penetrated the lower hull, detonating inside the engine compartment. Fuel ignited. The Maybach engine became a bomb. Flames roared out of the rear deck grills. The Tiger lurched to a halt, smoke pouring from every seam. The hatches flew open. Figures in black uniforms tumbled out, rolling in the snow to extinguish flames. 2 down. Kellerman barked into the radio. All units, engage now. Flank left, hit them from the tree-line. The other 3 Shermans roared to life. They surged out of cover, spreading wide, their guns already traversing. The Germans, focused on Cobra, were caught in a crossfire. The Americans fired on the move, sending 75mm rounds downrange at targets of opportunity. .1 Sherman scored a hit on a Tiger's track, immobilizing it. Another round penetrated a Tiger's rear armor, killing the engine. The German formation, so confident minutes before, was disintegrating into chaos. But the Tigers were far from beaten that a German commander, recognizing the ambush, barked orders over the radio. 3 Tigers pivoted in unison, their 88mm guns swinging toward the newly revealed American tanks. The first Tiger fired. The shell crossed the distance in a heartbeat and struck an American Sherman directly in the glassy plate. The result was catastrophic. The armor failed. The shell penetrated, detonating inside the crew compartment. The Sherman exploded from within, turret blown off, flames consuming the hull in seconds. There were no survivors. Kellerman's blood went cold. Stay mobile. Do not stop moving, he screamed into the radio. Cobra was already on the move again, racing toward the third anchor point. But the Germans were adapting. A Tiger commander had figured out the pattern. He ordered his gunner to lead the target, to predict where the Sherman would pivot next. The 88mm gun fired. The shell missed Cobra by inches, close enough that the shockwave rattled the crew's teeth. Kellerman felt the heat of the round's passage. They were running out of time. Out of luck, Kellerman made a decision. Driver, full speed. Straight at them. Rourke didn't hesitate. He shoved the throttle to its stop, and the Sherman lunged forward like a starving animal. The engine roared. The tracks bit into the frozen ground, throwing up chunks of snow and mud. The tank accelerated down the slope, heading directly toward the German line. It was suicide. And that's exactly why it worked. The German Tiger commanders had expected the Americans to retreat, to use mobility to disengage and call for air support. They hadn't expected a frontal assault. For 3 critical seconds, they hesitated, trying to process what they were seeing. 0.3 seconds was enough. Cobra closed the distance at 25 miles per hour. 600 meters became 500. 500 became 400. Tackett's world narrowed to the gun sight, to the reticle bouncing with every jolt of the suspension, to the Tiger growing larger in his view. 300 meters. Kellerman shouted. Gunner, target the third Tiger, left side exposed. Tackett saw it. A Tiger that had rotated to engage one of the other American Shermans had left its flank vulnerable. The angle was perfect. The range was closing fast. Identified. Fire. The gun bucked. The breech slammed backward. The spent casing ejected in a shower of sparks. Lindstrom was already reaching for the next round before the smoke cleared. The shot hit low, punching through the Tiger's side skirt and into the suspension. The round didn't penetrate the main hull, but it didn't need to. The impact shattered the road wheels and snapped the track. The Tiger lurched violently to the left, its broken track flailing like a severed limb. The driver tried to compensate, but the tank was immobilized. Hit. He's dead in the water, Tackett yelled. But there was no time to celebrate. .2 Tigers had finally acquired Cobra as a target. Both fired simultaneously. The first shell missed, impacting the ground to the right and throwing the Sherman sideways with the shockwave. The second shell grazed the turret, a screaming near miss that tore away the camouflage netting and sent debris ricocheting off the cupola. Kellerman ducked instinctively, shrapnel pinging off his helmet. 200 meters. Driver, hard left. Now, Rourke cranked the steering levers. The Sherman pivoted violently, skidding through a drift of snow. The momentum nearly threw Kellerman out of the cupola. He grabbed the rim with both hands, knuckles white. They were inside the Tiger's effective engagement range now. At 200 meters, the German gunners couldn't depress their massive 88mm guns low enough to track a fast-moving target directly below them. The Americans were too close, moving too fast, exploiting the one blind spot the Tigers had. Gunner. Target right. Immobilize Tiger. Finish him. Tackett traversed right. The crippled Tiger was trying to rotate its turret, but it was too slow. Tackett centered the reticle on the turret ring, the weakest point on any tank. Up. Fire. The round struck true. It punched through the thin armor at the base of the turret, penetrating into the fighting compartment. The Tiger shuddered. Smoke poured from the hatches. The gun barrel drooped. The crew bailed out, scrambling over the hull as flames began to spread. 3 Tigers down. But the cost was mounting. Kellerman glanced left and saw another American Sherman, callsign Rattler, explode in a fireball. An 88mm round had caught it broadside, penetrating the ammunition stowage. The turret flew 15 feet into the air before crashing back onto the burning hull. 2 American tanks left. 5 German Tigers still in the fight. The odds were still impossible. All units, converge on my position. We finish this together. The remaining Sherman, callsign Hammer, roared out of the tree lean, its commander acknowledging over the radio. Both American tanks now raced through the chaos, weaving between burning wrecks and shell craters, closing on the German position from 2 angles. The Tigers were forced to split their attention. 1 pivoted to engage Hammer, its turret traversing with agonizing slowness. The Sherman fired first, its round striking the Tiger's gun mantlet. The shell didn't penetrate, but the impact jammed the traverse mechanism. The Tiger's gun locked in place, unable to track. Cobra exploited the opening. Kellerman had positioned his tank at an oblique angle, using the smoke from burning vehicles as concealment. Tackett spotted the disabled Tiger through a gap in the haze. Target. Gun mantlet compromised. Elevation 0. Fire. The 4th Tiger died with a round through the thinner side armor, just below the turret. The penetrator ignited propellant bags. The explosion blew the loader's hatch clean off. Flames roared skyward. 4 down. The remaining 4 Tigers broke formation. They were retreating, not fleeing. German Panzer doctrine emphasized tactical withdrawal when outnumbered or outmaneuvered, but disengaging, trying to gain distance where their superior guns would regain the advantage. Kellerman wasn't going to let them. Driver, pursuit course. Stay on them. Sarge, we're almost out of main gun rounds. Lindstrom shouted from the loader's position. Kellerman did the math in his head. They'd fired 8 times. The Sherman carried 90 rounds, but they'd only loaded 30 before the engagement. That meant 22 left. Enough. Make every shot count. The chase became a running gunfight through the frozen valley. The Tigers fired over their shoulders, their shots going high or wide as they tried to hit targets while moving. The Shermans pursued relentlessly, using speed and terrain to close the gap. Hammer scored the next kill. Its 75mm round struck a retreating Tiger in the engine deck, setting the fuel tanks ablaze. The German crew abandoned the tank immediately, diving into the snow as their vehicle transformed into an inferno. 5 down. The remaining 3 Tigers reached a stone wall at the far end of the valley. They took up defensive positions, hulls angled, guns covering the approaches. It was a textbook defensive posture, but Kellerman wasn't using the textbook. Hammer, suppress from range. Cobra's going in. Sarge, do it. Rourke gunned the engine one more time. Cobra, accelerated toward the stone wall, angling to hit the German position from the flank. Tackett tracked a tiger through his sight, waiting for the perfect moment. One of the tigers fired. The shell passed so close to Cobra that Kellerman felt the heat through his jacket. Then they were at the wall. Rourke hit the brakes. The Sherman skidded sideways, tracks throwing up snow. The tank slammed to a halt parallel to the wall, mere meters from the nearest tiger. Point-blank range. Tackett didn't need to aim. The German tank filled his entire sight picture. Fire. The 75mm shell entered the tiger's side armor at an angle so shallow it should have bounced. But the armor was cold, brittle from hours in the freezing air. The shell punched through, tumbling as it penetrated, tearing through the interior like a buzzsaw. The tiger's ammunition exploded. The turret blew off with such force it sailed over the stone wall and landed 30 meters away, 0.6 down. The remaining two tigers panicked. One tried to reverse, its driver overcorrecting and slamming into the wall. The other attempted to traverse its gun toward Cobra, but Hammer hit it first, a perfect shot through the turret side. 0.7 down. The last tiger's crew bailed out before anyone could fire. They scrambled over the hull, hands raised, shouting "Kamerad! Kamerad!" in desperate, hoarse voices. Kellerman stood in the cupola, chest heaving, eyes scanning for threats. The valley was silent except for the crackle of flames and the hiss of escaping steam. 8 tigers. Destroyed or disabled. In 11 minutes. Kellerman keyed the radio, his voice shaking with adrenaline. Ceasefire. Ceasefire. We're clear. He slumped against the cupola rim, legs trembling. Around him, the valley was a graveyard of steel. German and American tanks burning side by side. Black smoke rising into the gray sky. Cobra had survived, barely. 0858 hours. January 17, 1945. The silence after battle is a living thing. Kellerman climbed out of the cupola, boots hitting the frozen ground with a hollow thud. His legs nearly buckled. Adrenaline was draining from his system, leaving behind a trembling exhaustion that made every movement feel like wading through deep water. Around him, the valley was a vision of apocalypse. 8 German tigers sat dead or dying across the ridgeline and valley floor. Some were still burning, flames roaring from open hatches and blown-out engine compartments. Others smoldered quietly, smoke rising in thin black columns. The largest, the first tiger Cobra had killed, was nothing more than a blackened skeleton, its turret lying upside down 20 meters from the hull. 2 American Shermans burned alongside them. Rattler and Sabre, their crews dead inside or scattered across the snow in pieces too small to identify. Kellerman felt the weight of those losses like a physical blow. But there was no time to mourn. Not yet. Rourke emerged from the driver's hatch, his face pale beneath a layer of soot and sweat. Tackett climbed out next, moving slowly, deliberately, as if afraid sudden movement might shatter him. Lindstrom and Dombrowski followed, both shaking from cold and shock. None of them spoke. They stood in a loose circle beside Cobra, staring at the wreckage. The tank itself was battered but intact. The spare tracks welded to the glacis were scarred and dented. The camouflage netting was gone, torn away by near misses. The tow shackle where the rope had been anchored was bent at an unnatural angle, the metal stressed beyond its design limits. But the engine still ran. The gun still worked. They were alive. Jesus Christ, Rourke finally whispered. Jesus Christ, we did it. Kellerman nodded slowly. He didn't trust his voice yet. The crew of Hammer approached on foot, their Sherman idling 50 meters away. The commander, a lieutenant named Brock from Ohio, looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 15 minutes. His hands were still trembling. Kellerman, Brock said quietly. That was the craziest goddamn thing I've ever seen. Kellerman met his eyes. It worked. Barely enough. Movement caught Kellerman's attention. The surviving German Tiger crew, 5 men in black Panzer uniforms, stood under guard near the stone wall, hands on their heads. One of them, an older man with a commander's insignia, was staring at Cobra with an expression somewhere between disbelief and respect. Kellerman walked over. The German commander straightened slightly as Kellerman approached. He was maybe 40, graying at the temples, face lined with exhaustion. His uniform was singed. His hands were burned. "You speak English?" Kellerman asked. The German nodded. "Some. Yes." Kellerman gestured toward the burning tigers. "How long have you been commanding?" 3 years. "North Africa, Russia, France." The man's voice was hoarse. Never have I seen Sherman fight like this. We didn't have a choice." The German looked at him for a long moment. "The rope. That was improvised." "Yeah. Clever." The word came out bitter, tinged with grudging admiration. "We thought you would run. We thought." He trailed off, shaking his head. "We were wrong." Kellerman didn't respond. There was nothing to say. He turned and walked back toward his crewed-up BY-0915 hours. The first American reinforcements arrived, a platoon of infantry in half-tracks, accompanied by a reconnaissance unit. The infantry lieutenant took one look at the valley and stopped in his tracks. "Holy hell, what happened here?" Kellerman gave him the short version. 8 tigers. 2 Shermans lost. 11-minute engagement. The lieutenant listened with growing disbelief, glancing between Kellerman and the burning German tanks as if trying to reconcile the story with the evidence. "You're telling me 4 Shermans took out 8 tigers. 2 Shermans by the end," Kellerman corrected. "And yeah, that's what happened." The lieutenant shook his head slowly. "Division's not going to believe this. I don't care if they believe it. It's done." A medic crew arrived shortly after, checking the survivors for wounds. Kellerman's crew was bruised, battered, and suffering from mild concussions from the repeated shockwaves, but otherwise intact. The German prisoners were treated as well, burns bandaged, one man with a broken arm splinted. By 1,000 hours, a graves registration team arrived to recover the bodies from Rattler and Sabre. Kellerman watched them work, his jaw tight. He'd known those men, fought alongside them for weeks. Now they were being zipped into rubberized body bags, tags checked, serial numbers recorded. War reduced men to paperwork. Rourke stood beside him, silent. After a long moment, he spoke quietly. "They didn't die for nothing, Sarge." Kellerman didn't answer immediately. He watched the medics carry a stretcher past, a shape under a green tarp. Finally, he nodded. "No, they didn't." By midday, intelligence officers arrived from regiment. They photographed the destroyed tigers from every angle, measuring penetration holes, documenting damage patterns. They interviewed Kellerman and his crew separately, recording every detail of the engagement. One officer, a captain with wire-rimmed glasses, seemed particularly interested in the rope technique. "You're saying you used cargo rope as a pivot anchor?" "That's right. And you practiced this maneuver beforehand?" "For 2 weeks. Whenever we had downtime." The captain scribbled notes furiously. "This needs to be disseminated. Every tank unit in the theater should know about this." Kellerman shrugged. "If it helps somebody else stay alive, fine." The captain paused, looking up from his notepad. "Sergeant, do you understand what you accomplished here? 8 tigers. That's an entire heavy panzer platoon. The Germans don't have many of these left, and you just wiped one out with 2 Shermans. 2 Shermans and 10 dead Americans," Kellerman said flatly. "Don't forget that part." The captain's expression softened. "No one's forgetting them, Sergeant." By late afternoon, word of the engagement had spread through the division. Tank crews from other units found excuses to visit the site. They walked among the burning tigers, stunned into silence. Many had been fighting Sherman since North Africa, since Normandy. They knew the brutal arithmetic of tank versus tank combat. They knew that tigers were supposed to be untouchable, and yet here were 8 of them, destroyed in minutes by American ingenuity and desperation. One crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant from Texas, stood beside Cobra for a full 5 minutes, running his hand along the scarred glassy plate. He examined the welded track links, the bent toe shackle, the rope burns on the rear deck. Finally, he turned to Kellerman. "How many times you practiced that rope trick?" "Maybe 20, 30 times. And it worked every time. Worked enough times." The sergeant nodded slowly. "I'm stealing this. My whole company's stealing this. You just rewrote the book, son." Kellerman didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired, hollowed out. But he understood what the man was saying. Tactics were currency in war. What worked got copied, refined, disseminated. By next week, tank crews across the front would be practicing rope pivot maneuvers. Some would survive because of it. That mattered. By evening, a full after-action report had been compiled and sent up the chain of command. It reached 3rd Army Headquarters by nightfall, then SHAF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, by the following morning. General Patton himself reportedly read the report twice, then demanded to meet Kellerman's crew personally. But before any of that could happen, the war moved on. On January 18th, just 24 hours after the engagement, Kellerman's platoon was ordered to advance. The Battle of the Bulge was entering its final phase. German forces were retreating across the Reich. Every available unit was being thrown into the pursuit. There was no time for parades or commendations. Cobra rolled out at dawn, part of a larger armored column pushing east toward the Rhine. The crew was exhausted, running on coffee and adrenaline fumes, but they moved anyway. That's what soldiers did. The rope stayed lashed to the rear deck. In the weeks that followed, reports began filtering in from other units. A Sherman company in the Hurtgen Forest had used the rope pivot technique to ambush a Panther platoon, destroying 3 tanks without loss. A reconnaissance unit near the Roer River credited the maneuver with saving them from a Tiger II ambush. Another crew in the Saar region improvised their own version using steel cables instead of rope. The tactic was spreading. Tank training centers in England and France began incorporating rope pivot drills into their curriculum. Field manuals were updated. Crews were issued standardized rigging kits, heavy-duty rope, snap hooks, pulleys, and trained to anchor and release under combat conditions. Kellerman's improvisation had become doctrine, but the man himself remained largely unknown outside his immediate unit. He didn't give interviews. He didn't write memoirs. When reporters showed up asking questions, he deflected credit to his crew, to the other tank commanders, to the men who hadn't made it home. The war ended in May 1945. Kellerman survived. So did Rourke, Tackett, Lindstrom, and Dombrowski. Cobra made it all the way to the Elbe River before the ceasefire. By then, the tank was held together by welds, prayer, and stubbornness. The engine burned oil. The transmission ground like gravel. The gun had fired over 300 rounds in combat, but it still ran. The crew returned to the United States in July 1945. They were awarded Bronze Stars for valor, though the ceremony was quiet and bureaucratic. No press, no fanfare, just a colonel pinning medals on jackets in a drafty warehouse in New Jersey. Kellerman went home to Scranton. He got a job at the same machine shop he'd worked at before the war. He married his high school sweetheart. He never spoke much about what happened in Belgium, but he kept a photograph that was taken by an army photographer on January 17, 1945, just hours after the engagement. It showed Cobra sitting in the valley, surrounded by burning Tigers. The crew stood beside the tank, exhausted, their faces streaked with soot. Kellerman was in the middle, one hand resting on the scarred glassy plate that on the back of the photo, someone had written, "The day we stopped being afraid." The German Tiger crews who survived the engagement told different stories. The commander Kellerman had spoken to, Hauptmann Ernst Kohler, was sent to a POW camp in England. He was interviewed extensively by British intelligence officers, who wanted to understand how 8 Tigers had been defeated so decisively. Kohler was candid in his assessment. "We underestimated them," he said in one recorded interview. "We saw the Sherman as inferior. Weaker steel, smaller gun. We believed our training and equipment made us invincible. That arrogance killed my men." He paused, then added, "The Americans fought like men who had nothing to lose. And they were smarter than we gave them credit for." Kohler survived the war. He returned to Germany in 1947 and became a schoolteacher. In the 1960s, he wrote a short memoir about his experiences as a panzer commander. He devoted an entire chapter to the engagement on January 17, 1945, describing it as the moment he realized Germany had already lost the war. "We had the better tanks," he wrote, "but they had the better soldiers." By the 1950s, the rope pivot technique had been largely phased out of armored doctrine. Newer tanks, the M26 Pershing, the M46 Patton, were faster, better armored, and more maneuverable. They didn't need improvised rigging to survive engagements. But the lesson remained. Ingenuity mattered more than steel. Adaptability mattered more than doctrine. And courage, The willingness to charge into the teeth of impossible odds because there was no other choice mattered most of all. The Sherman tank, so often mocked and dismissed, had proven that battles weren't won by the best equipment. They were won by the men inside the machines, and what they were willing to do when everything was on the line. On January 17, 1945, 5 men in a 30-ton Sherman named Cobra proved that lesson in blood and fire. And the world took notice. There's a moment in every war when the impossible becomes inevitable, when the underdog stops running and turns to fight, when desperation transforms into defiance, when men look at the odds stacked against them and decide that survival isn't enough. That victory, however costly, is the only acceptable outcome. January 17, 1945, was one of those moments. The engagement in that frozen Belgian valley lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes that redefined what American tank crews believed they were capable of. 11 minutes that shattered the myth of German invincibility and proved that steel alone doesn't win wars. People do. The Sherman was never the best tank of World War II. It wasn't the fastest, the strongest, or the most heavily armed. But it was good enough. And in the hands of crews willing to adapt, to improvise, to risk everything on unconventional tactics, good enough became extraordinary. Kellerman and his crew didn't defeat 8 Tigers because they had superior equipment. They won because they refused to fight the battle the Germans expected. They used terrain. They used speed. They used a length of cargo rope and the kind of desperate creativity that only emerges when death is the alternative. Yet that's the lesson etched into the burned-out hulls of those Tigers. War doesn't care about your doctrine. It doesn't care about your training manuals or your technical specifications. It cares about adaptability. About the willingness to throw out the rulebook when the rulebook gets you killed. The rope pivot technique was never officially named. It never appeared in any major tactical manual under its own heading. But for a brief window in early 1945, it saved lives. It gave American crews a fighting chance against tanks that should have slaughtered them. And it reminded everyone, from privates to generals, that innovation doesn't always come from laboratories or design committees. Sometimes it comes from a sergeant with a coil of rope and a refusal to die quietly. Today, the valley where the engagement took place is peaceful. The burned tanks were scrapped decades ago. The snow that covered the battlefield that morning has melted and fallen 1,000 times since. There's no monument, no plaque, just fields and trees and the quiet flow of the Our River in the distance. But the story remains that IT lives in the memoirs of veterans who heard about it and felt hope. It lives in the tactical manuals that still emphasize adaptability over rigid adherence to doctrine. It lives in every tanker who learned that courage and creativity matter more than armor thickness. And it lives in the memory of 10 Americans who didn't come home, but who died buying time for their brothers to win. The Sherman earned its place in history not because it was exceptional, but because the men who crewed it were. They turned a cardboard tank into a weapon of legend. They faced down Tigers with nothing but guts, coordination, and a belief that even impossible odds could be beaten. They were right. And that cold morning in Belgium, they proved it.